Pulitzer Prize-winning author Lawrence Wright is next on Book TV from the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. He talks about his book, 13 Days in September, on the Camp David Accords of 1978.
Ladies and gentlemen, Lawrence Wright.
Hi, thank you. I appreciate you all coming. So I've been asked to talk about two books. Originally, I was asked to talk about 13 Days in September, the Carter-Begin-Sadat Summit in 1978, which I will do. But since I was invited to this conference, another book of mine has come out. It's a collection of my articles on terrorism called The Terror Years. And so I will first talk about peace, and then I will talk about terror. And it seems like a natural progression, right? I guess the best way of beginning this is telling you how I got started with 13 Days. Gerald Rafshoon, who was Jimmy Carter's media advisor in the White House, called me up out of the blue and asked if I'd be willing to write a play about Camp David. And his pitch was, a born-again Christian, an Orthodox Jew, and a pious Muslim go behind closed doors for 13 days, and emerge with the only durable peace in the Middle East. It's a pretty good pitch. And it was affecting to me because my wife and I had lived in Georgia when Jimmy was governor and when he ran for president. We had lived in Egypt when Nasser died and Sadat became president. And as a reporter, I'd spent a lot of time in Israel. So I thought, if not me, who? It seemed like a natural for me. So we went down to Plains, and Jimmy and Rosalind live in this incredibly modest little house. It's a one-story ranch house that they built in 1950 when he retired from the Navy and came to take over the really near bankrupt peanut business that was left over when his father died. And we sat in the den. They were sitting on this little blue couch with flowers on it and matching blue curtains. And behind the couch was a painting of the room we were sitting in that Jimmy had painted. And it looked just like an illustration from Goodnight Moon. And all it missed was the red balloon. And so at the time I was thinking, I'm about to do a play and I need to know who's on stage. You got Carter, Begin, and Sadat. Anybody else? And so Jerry Rafshoon says, well, Mr. President, Larry works for the New Yorker. And he recently wrote a piece about Scientology. Oh, I read that. I found that most intriguing. And Rosalind wheels around and says, since when did you start reading the New Yorker? Oh, I read it every week. I thought I found my fourth character. I needed somebody who could talk to Jimmy Carter like that. And Jimmy is 93, and Rosalind was born in the house next door to him. He saw her in the cradle. They've known each other for almost a century, and they still have that kind of relationship. So, and as a matter of fact, Camp David was her idea. Subject, something I found out while I was down there. So I, after that, went to Israel and to Egypt to talk to the surviving members of those negotiating teams and to see how this actually happened. Because I've lived a lot in the Middle East. And if there's one lesson you learn from spending a long time in the Middle East, is that things can always get worse. And yet here's one thing one agreement between Israel and Egypt hasn't had a single violation in 38 years. And think how bad things are now, how much worse they would be if these two nations, which had 4 wars in a single generation, were still at war with each other. Egypt was the only country in the Middle East that really posed an existential threat to the existence of Israel. Now, what I learned, first of all, let me tell you a little bit about the men that came to Camp David. First of all, Jimmy Carter. He was a one-term governor in Georgia. He lost his first race to Lester Maddox, one of the most racist figures in Georgia's history. And he started running for election the next day. And he won 4 years later. He was a man, Jimmy had, when he grew up, the only Jew he knew was his uncle in Chattanooga, Louis Brownstein, who had married Carter's aunt. He was an insurance salesman who loved professional wrestling and could chin himself with one hand. This made a huge impression on young Jimmy Carter. The first Arab he met was at the Daytona 500 when he was governor. So this was his experience. And when he was elected governor, while he was running for his governor when he successfully, his strongest supporter was an Iranian Jew named David Rabin, who was a businessman in Savannah, who was also a pilot. And he used to fly Carter around the state to make speeches. And, there was so much time in the air that sometimes Rabin would take a nap and Jimmy would take over the wheel. And one time, the plane coughed and died. And Carter said, David! David! What? We're out of gas. And he said, well, then we're going to crash. And he let that sit there for a moment. And then he reached out and turned on the spare gas tank. Now, a lot of people don't tease Jimmy Carter. But when he calmed down a bit, he said, David, the race is nearly over and it appears that I'm going to be successful. You've been so helpful to me. What can I do for you? And he said, Jimmy, I don't need anything from you. There's only one thing I would like from you, which is to do something to remove the millstone of racial hatred that has weighed this state down for such a long time. And so Carter reached over and got a flight map, and he wrote out, I say to you that the time for racial discrimination is over. And he showed it to Rabin and says, if I'm inaugurated, I will say this. And Rabin said, sign it. So he signed it, and he said it, and that got him on the cover of Time magazine and planted some ideas in his head. In 1973, when he was governor, he and Rosalind went to the Holy Land. And Golda Meir was the prime minister, and she lent them a station wagon, and they drove all around the country and went over into the West Bank, got special permission to bathe in the River Jordan, which was very meaningful to them. And they saw the settlers. At that time, Carter estimated there were about 1,500 of them, and he already saw that they were a real obstacle to peace. But he was also struck by how secular they were. So when he brought the station wagon back to Golda, he said, he told her about how secular the settlers were, and he said, whenever the Jews turn away from God, they lose politically and militarily. And she laughed in his face. This is governor of Georgia telling me. And then a couple of months later, Anwar Sadat sent the Egyptian army across the Suez Canal, and Golda Meir had to step down. Now, I'll tell you a bit about Anwar Sadat. When Carter got elected, Walter Mondale, his vice president, told me that on the very first day in office, he walked into the Oval Office, and there's Jimmy Carter sitting there, and he said his top priority is to bring peace to the Middle East. And Mondale was like, what would you think? This is this peanut farmer from Georgia, and he's going to bring peace to the Middle East. And that's your top priority? He felt that God had put him in that office to reconcile these people. So he began interviewing Middle Eastern leaders who, in the course of things, come to Washington. And he could not, they were all, in his estimate, just hopeless, until Anwar Sadat walked into the office. And it was love at first sight. He actually said he loved Anwar Sadat. It's not normal diplomatic language. But there were a lot of things they had in common. Jimmy used to plow the red dirt in Georgia barefoot behind a mule, and Anwar Sadat would do the same in this little upper Nile Delta village called Mit Abul Kum, behind a water buffalo. So they had some similarities. But Sadat, we look at him now, we think, this visionary, man of peace. When he was a child in the Nile Delta, he had this. When he was 12 years old, Mahatma Gandhi came through Suez on his way to London to negotiate the future of India, and little Anwar Sadat was totally captivated by the fact that this small brown man was bringing an empire to his knees. So he discarded his clothes and went around wearing an apron. He made a spindle and began spinning thread. He led a goat around town. He was constantly imitating Mahatma Gandhi. You can imagine what the other people in the village thought of him. A bunch of kids were running and were jumping into an irrigation pond, and so he ran and jumped in with them, and then he realized he couldn't swim. And he says that the thought that went through his mind was, if I die, Egypt will have lost Anwar Sadat. What kind of child thinks like that? But he was shopping for qualities of greatness. But one other figure that he deeply admired was Adolf Hitler. Now, this wasn't totally unknown in Egypt, which was occupied by the British at the time, and Hitler was fighting against the British. But Sadat took it to a higher level. He collaborated with a bunch of Nazi spies. Also, he joined what he called his murder society. They liked to think that they modeled themselves on the French resistance, but mainly what they did was pick off drunken British soldiers in the streets at night in Cairo. But when Sadat became a part of the group, he tried to raise their level to assassinating the prime minister. They failed at that on 2 occasions, but they did kill a government minister. Sadat spent 5 years in prison before he escaped. One of the most significant moments in Sadat's life, and I would have to say this is one of the most significant moments in the entire Middle East, was the 1967 war. Sadat was in the military, and at the time he was the vice president. Egypt was provoking Israel, and the Israelis were terrified. They were digging trenches in city parks for the mass casualties that they expected to have. They were passing out gas masks because Egypt was already in a war in Yemen and they were using poison gas. And he blocked the Straits of Tiran. There were a lot of provocations that took place. And then, moreover, there was Jordan, which would probably fall in, and then there was Syria, and so there was 3 Arab armies suddenly that they would have to face. And so they struck first. And it's called the 6-Day War. You might as well call it the 60-minute war, because they eliminated the Egyptian Air Force within a very short space of time. And then eliminated the military threat from 3 Arab nations almost completely for a while. The psychological effect of this was, first of all, on Jews. There had, up until that point, been this tremendous outmigration from Israel. And then suddenly, it was a miracle. You know, they had recovered Jerusalem. Jews began to stream into Israel. And this awakened a lot of fundamentalist Christians, because these are signs of the end of days. And these are, this is a time when the ingathering of Jews is taking place, and there was a tremendous amount of excitement in the Jewish and in the Christian communities. In the Muslim community, the effect was, God has turned away from us. Why did this happen to us? And the answer for many people was, we are not good enough Muslims. We're not pure enough. We're not fundamental enough. We're not radical enough. So that stream of radicalism, which was already present, began to blossom and grow. So, 1973, Sadat sends his Egyptian army across the canal. It was a shattering blow to the mentality of Israel, because they felt invulnerable after 1967. And then, in 1977, Sadat was making a speech at the parliament in Egypt. And he put down his papers, and he said, I would go anywhere. I would go to the ends of the earth. I would go to Israel. I would go speak to their Knesset if it would save one more Egyptian life. And nobody believed it. They applauded. It wasn't even mentioned in the newspapers the next day. 10 days later, Sadat's plane is circling over Tel Aviv. Now, you'd have to understand the thinking of both sides at this historic moment. Here is Israel's greatest enemy coming to talk to them, really uninvited. He invited himself, but formally they had to invite him. But the Israeli symphony was out there in at Ben Gurion Airport. They didn't even know how to play the Egyptian national anthem. They listened to Radio Cairo to try to get a sense of how it goes, and then there was the question of, is Sadat really in the plane? Could it be full of terrorists? Could it be full of explosives? We're going to have all the leaders of Israel here waiting for him. There were snipers all over the rooftops just in case. And the plane is just at Shabbat, at the end of Shabbat. His plane comes in. There are searchlights that catch the fuselage, and people are on tenterhooks. And then it lands, and Sadat comes down. He embraces Golda Meir. He shakes hands with Ariel Sharon. And people are agog. They're jubilant. Would not describe it. It was, a sense of unreality that this could happen. And then he went and made his speech in the Knesset, and it was stern. But he expected something in return. And he left Jerusalem empty-handed. And a lot of that was because of Menachem Begin. Now, Begin is a fascinating figure in history. He was born in a little Polish town called Brisk. And his first memory was of Polish soldiers flogging a Jew. When the Nazis invaded Poland, Begin's parents, his mother was in the hospital with pneumonia. And the Nazis went through the hospital murdering the patients in their beds. His father, they tied him up with ropes and filled his pockets with rocks and threw him into the river Bug. Menachem was hiding in Lithuania at the time, and then he spent 2 years in Soviet prisons in the Gulag before Stalin released all the Poles to fight the Nazis. And so Begin joined a Jewish unit, and they were sent to Palestine. And when he got to Palestine, he became head of Irgun, which was a terrorist organization. And as a terrorist, he was brilliant. There have been very few in the history of terrorism that had quite as much effect as Menachem Begin. He was inventive and imaginative and theatrical. For instance, when the British hanged 3 terrorists who'd been tried and convicted in a military court, Begin hanged 3 British sergeants and booby-trapped their bodies. He blew up the King David Hotel, which was at that point the most luxurious hotel in the Middle East, but a wing of it was also devoted to being the nerve center of the British Mandate. 91 people were killed. And this broke the spirit of the British occupation, and they withdrew and turned over the problem of Palestine to the United Nations. Now, just to underscore the effect in history, after 9/11, when the American troops went into Kandahar, into bin Laden's, believed it, they applauded. It wasn't even mentioned in the newspapers the next day. 10 days later, Sadat's plane is circling over Tel Aviv. Now, you'd have to understand the thinking of both sides at this historic moment. Here is Israel's greatest enemy coming to talk to them, really uninvited. He invited himself, but formally they had to invite him. But the Israeli symphony was out there at Ben Gurion Airport. They didn't even know how to play the Egyptian national anthem. They listened to Radio Cairo to try to get a sense of how it goes, and then there was the question of, is Sadat really in the plane? Could it be full of terrorists? Could it be full of explosives? We're going to have all the leaders of Israel here waiting for him. There were snipers all over the rooftops just in case. And the plane is just at Shabbat, at the end of Shabbat. His plane comes in. There are searchlights that catch the fuselage, and people are on tenterhooks. And then it lands, and Sadat comes down. He embraces Golda Meir. He shakes hands with Ariel Sharon. And people are agog. They're jubilant. Would not describe it. It was, a sense of unreality that this could happen. And then he went and made his speech in the Knesset, and it was stern. But he expected something in return. And he left Jerusalem empty-handed. And a lot of that was because of Menachem Begin. Now, Begin is a fascinating figure in history. He was born in a little Polish town called Brisk. And his first memory was of Polish soldiers flogging a Jew. When the Nazis invaded Poland, Begin's parents, his mother was in the hospital with pneumonia, and the Nazis went through the hospital murdering the patients in their beds. His father, they tied him up with ropes and filled his pockets with rocks and threw him into the river Bug. Menachem was hiding in Lithuania at the time, and then he spent 2 years in Soviet prisons in the Gulag before Stalin released all the Poles to fight the Nazis. And so Begin joined a Jewish unit, and they were sent to Palestine. And when he got to Palestine, he became head of Irgun, which was a terrorist organization. And as a terrorist, he was brilliant. There have been very few in the history of terrorism that had quite as much effect as Menachem Begin. He was inventive and imaginative and theatrical. For instance, when the British hanged 3 terrorists who'd been tried and convicted in military court, Begin hanged 3 British sergeants and booby-trapped their bodies. He blew up the King David Hotel, which was at that point the most luxurious hotel in the Middle East, but a wing of it was also devoted to being the nerve center of the British Mandate. 91 people were killed. And this broke the spirit of the British occupation, and they withdrew and turned over the problem of Palestine to the United Nations. Now, just to underscore the effect in history, after 9/11, when the American troops went into Kandahar, into bin Laden's compound, they found in his library a copy of Begin's memoir. And I think it must have been because he would want to know, how does a terrorist leader become a prime minister and win the Nobel Peace Prize? It's a trick that very few people have accomplished in history. After the British left, Begin turned his attention to the Palestinians. Just to underscore the effect in history, after 9/11, when the American troops went into Kandahar, into bin Laden's compound, they found in his library a copy of Begin's memoir. And I think it must have been because he would want to know, how does a terrorist leader become a prime minister and win the Nobel Peace Prize? It's a trick that very few people have accomplished in history. After the British left, Begin turned his attention to the Palestinians. And there was a little village just outside Jerusalem called Deir Yassin. Actually, I visited it. It's now a psychiatric hospital. It's very weird. The psychiatrists have their offices in what were Palestinian homes, and the grounds are occupied by lunatics. And it was a Palestinian village. It was a peaceful village. They had a non-aggression pact with their ultra-Orthodox neighbors. But Begin determined that it stood above a strategic approach to the city and had to be taken. And so there was some initial resistance. And Begin's men went through the village, throwing grenades through the windows, killing entire families. It was a massacre. 20 men who survived were taken to a quarry and shot. Some of the women and children who were survivors were placed on a flatbed truck and paraded through Jerusalem and then deposited outside the city. There were Palestinians who were already leaving, but after that, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled into the West Bank and neighboring Arab countries. So these were the men who came to Camp David. An inexperienced, unpopular, failing president, a Nazi collaborator and an assassin, and a terrorist. Now, those men, Carter had budgeted 3 or 4 days to try to reach an accommodation. He actually thought that if he could only get them alone, they would get to know each other, they would like each other, they would come to trust each other. After the second day, he realized he couldn't put them in the same room at all. They hated each other. And it was really one thing that was key. I guess if you're going to draw a lesson from Camp David, there are no perfect partners for peace. These are really flawed individuals. But one thing they had in common a lot of political courage, and they were willing to make the compromises and sacrifices that peace requires. The second thing is it took America to make that peace. They couldn't make peace with each other, but Carter very reluctantly put forward an American plan, and he developed a technique of he would list all the things that had to be resolved, and then and each day that it made any, when he finally could scratch one thing off, the list would get shorter and shorter. Finally, they agreed to the American plan. Now, those are two of the lessons that we can take from the success of Camp David, but there's another part to the Camp David Accords, and that has to do with Israel and the Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians weren't present. At the time, the PLO was considered a terrorist organization, and Carter, it was politically toxic to deal with them. It was naive to think that they could resolve the Palestinian question themselves, but they laid out a roadmap for the eventual solution to the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians. Every attempt, even up to Kerry's latest failed attempt, has been built on the architecture of those Camp David Accords. Now, this leads me to segue to terrorism, because that entire Palestinian diaspora, 750,000 people, that was the entire population of people who fled. And think of all the misery that they've endured, and the misery that the terrorism that came out of the modern terrorist movement that erupted from that diaspora has caused to not just to the Israelis, but people all over the world. Right now, there are 5 million Syrians who are refugees outside of their country. It totally dwarfs the Palestinian diaspora. And they're just a part of this immense refugee stream that is greater than at any time since World War II. Now, just on the Syrian side of it, half of those refugees are children. And according to UNICEF, only 20% of them are getting an education. So if you were 5 years old in 2011 when the Civil War began, you've already lost your elementary education. Just think what kind of future you might have. Now, when we talk about terrorism, people like to think that there is a cause of terror. And it's poverty. It's lack of education. It's tyranny. It's injustice. It's unemployment. It's gender apartheid. There's a longer list. Not a single one of those things has ever been shown to be the cause of why somebody would behead somebody or stand in line to blow himself up at a fruit market. And the idea that you can deal with the root causes of terror, there's no evidence that that works either. So terrorism is the way I think of it, all of these causes that I've listed are tributaries into this river of despair that runs through the Arab Middle East and southern Asia. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about how I got started in writing about terrorism. I wrote a movie in 1998 called The Siege with Denzel Washington and Annette Bening were the stars. And it was, at the time, I was asked to write about a woman in the CIA, and that was the idea. And, the Cold War was over. Who's the enemy? It was a real dilemma. And I finally realized that the CIA did have a real-life antagonist, and it was the FBI. So once I discovered this axis, and Denzel's the FBI agent, and Annette is the CIA agent. What they were fighting over at the time was who was going to control terrorism in the United States. The question the movie asked, what would happen if terrorism came to America, the way that it already had visited London and Paris, not to mention Tel Aviv. You know, other cities, other countries had dealt with this problem. How would we deal with it? And there were protests outside the theaters. There were pickets, Muslims who were tired of being stereotyped as terrorists. It was a box office failure. And then in August, before the movie even came out, August of 98, the movie came out in November of 98. In August of 98, Al-Qaeda began its first attack on America by bombing 2 embassies in East Africa. 224 people were killed. More than 100 people were blinded by the flying glass. But there was another bombing that took place in that same month that most people don't remember in Cape Town, South Africa, at a Planet Hollywood. And it was said by the radical Islamist group that claimed credit that they were protesting the trailers for The Siege. And because Bruce Willis, the co-star of the movie, was a partial owner of that restaurant chain. 2 people were killed and a little girl lost her leg. And the movie wasn't even out yet. And I was shocked and devastated. And then, weirdly enough, after 9/11, The Siege became the most rented movie in America, making me the first war profiteer in the war on terror. I was trying to get out of journalism just before 9/11. I was planning to be a movie director. And then 9/11 happened. And I sent, you remember in New York that there were, the phones were down for a while. And so I sent an email to David Remnick, the editor at New Yorker, and I said, put me to work. And we had conference call when the phones came back on later that afternoon, and there were New Yorker writers scattered all over the country, grounded because the planes weren't flying. And he said, just go out and find individual stories and send them in to me, narratives, and I'll try to blend them together. This became the famous Black Issue. And I was fortunate to find this young man named Kurt Yeltsin, who was a young reporter. He was supposed to be in an appointment at the Windows in the World restaurant on the top floor of World Trade Center. And he, for the first time in his life, he slept through his subway stop. And so he frantically got back on the next train. In the World Trade Center, the elevator bank, there were 110 elevators. You had to go up an escalator to get to it. And he went up the escalator and he ran into the elevator, and there was an elevator attendant who was holding the door, and Kurt was looking at his phone to see what time it was, and very impatient because he was running late, and this well-put-together businesswoman was taking her own sweet time, walking to the elevator. And just as she stepped into the elevator, he noticed that she had a rose tattoo on her ankle, and then the plane hit. And in a moment, in that moment, it was in some ways like the last bit of innocence, because nobody knew what had happened. Was it an earthquake? Was it a bomb? There had been an attempt to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993. And so Kurt stepped off the elevator, and the doors kind of accordioned, and he saw objects on the ground that were weird. They were different sizes. Some, he said, like a clock radio, and some like an office chair. But they were just amorphous globs, probably of concrete. And then he saw these glass doors that led outside, and he thought that he was just leaving the building. But remember, he had to go up that escalator. So he was walking out into a plaza. And he walked out, and first thing he saw were hundreds of shoes everywhere, and things that he thought were luggage, and then he realized they were torsos. And so I got his story, which became the bookend of the black issue. And after that, I realized, that I felt I had to get to the bottom of what had actually happened here. And I began reading obituaries that were streaming online, because how do you take such a vast human tragedy and make it human? I always try to look for individuals who can take our readers into a world they don't know. And I call these individuals donkeys. I know it sounds derogatory, but a donkey is a beast of burden who can carry a lot of information on his back. And so as I was looking through on the Washington Post site, I found an obituary for John O'Neill, who was the head of counterterrorism for the FBI. He's the guy Denzel Washington played in the movie. And so the obituary made him sound like kind of a disgrace, because he had taken classified information out of the Bureau and he had been fired or told to resign, and he took a job as the head of security at the World Trade Center. And I thought at the time, how ironic. The man who was supposed to get bin Laden didn't. Bin Laden got him. But the more I found out about him, I realized that it was not irony. It was Greek. When he took that job, people told him, "John, you'll be safe now. They already tried the World Trade Center." And he said, "No, they'll come back to finish the job." So he instinctively placed himself at ground zero. And that is one of the profiles that I include in the terror collection. Roberta and I lived in Egypt when we were young teachers, and I was trying to get into Saudi Arabia to write about bin Laden, but they weren't letting me in. And so I decided I'll go to Egypt and write about the number 2 man, Ayman al-Zawahiri, now number 1. And I found out that he was really the brains behind Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda at the time was really an Egyptian organization with a Saudi head on it. Ayman Zawahiri started a cell to overthrow the Egyptian government when he was 15 years old. I just want you to appreciate the dedication of people like that form our most fearsome enemies. I spent a lot of time bouncing around. I went to Khartoum 3 times. The first time I went to Sudan, I had been pressing my Sudanese contacts, my intelligence contacts, to help me hook up with Al-Qaeda. And one day, I got a knock on the door, and there was one of these Sudanese guys, a big character who'd been somewhat helpful to me, and he had with him this kind of rotund, jolly fellow with this kind of conical Indonesian hat, and come on in. And at the time, I was having back trouble. And you know those rubber balls that people when you have. So I've been carrying this rubber ball all over the world with me, and it's a lot of trouble to blow it up. And anyway, I gave him the chair, and I sat down on the ball, and Ahmed, the intelligence guy, his eyes were bobbing. He was so sleepy. I said, "Ahmed, just lie down." So he fell right asleep and left me with this Al-Qaeda guy. And so I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "You can call me Loé." Okay, and so I started probing, and it turned out Loé knew everything. He was a dream. He knew about the beginning of Al-Qaeda. You know, when bin Laden came to him and said he wanted to start this organization, and Loé said, "Yeah." And then I said, "How are you going to get them to the battle? Air France?" I think he slapped his knee. I said, "Who is this guy?" It was terribly maddening to me. So I came back to the U.S. and I started Loé. It was all my only clue. And so I did some triangulating, and I found the name Mohammed Loé Bayazid. His Al-Qaeda name is Abu Rida al-Suri. And he was the guy that took the notes at the founding of Al-Qaeda. And he was bin Laden's business manager. So, you know, what a great source. And so I went back to Khartoum to see him, and he wouldn't see me. And that was disappointing. And so I went back a third time. He agreed to see me. And I said, Loy, why didn't you see me last time? Because it's a lot of trouble to come to Khartoum. And he said, well, I didn't know how seriously to take you. Last time I met you, you were sitting on a balloon. So one of my more noble moments in dealing with Al-Qaeda. The Saudis finally let me in after a year and a half. They wouldn't let me in as a reporter. So I got a job as an expat worker. I was the mentor to these young reporters at this newspaper in Jeddah, bin Laden's hometown. And it was a far better arrangement than if I had been just a reporter. Instead of being in the hotel, I was living in a middle-class Saudi flat. I had a car, I had a job I had to go to every day, and had all these wonderful young reporters teaching me far more about their culture than I could ever have done on my own. And I learned things about Saudi Arabia that I think really helped me understand a lot about that culture. That, for one thing, Saudi Arabia doesn't really have a civil society. What we're doing here wouldn't be done. For one thing, the women wouldn't be here. But the idea of freedom of assembly is almost, it's not unknown, but it's rarely practiced. There's a perniciousness about the gender apartheid that is, just to give you an example, when I went there, I was supposed to be mentoring young Saudi women journalists as well, but I said, where are they? They you can't see them. They're in an office under the stairwell. And I said, I can't teach them if I can't see them. So finally, it was agreed that once a week I would meet with the Saudi women journalists, and they would all come into the conference room with my young men. So once a week, this little black train came through, and they had the black hijab and the black abaya, but there was one of them who also had the niqab, and all he covered everything except her little gold-rimmed cat-eye glasses, Najla. And she was a case. She liked covering herself, and because she said, I can make faces at people and they don't know it. That's a small consolation, but there you are. She had to go to an interview in Riyadh one day before the first flight from Jeddah arrived. So she had to fly in the night before. Now, as a single Saudi woman, she can't travel without her guardian's permission, her male guardian. That could be her father, her brother, her husband, even her son, whoever is the man in charge. So she got permission, and then she flew to Riyadh, and she came off the airplane, and she sat down in the airport, because as a single Saudi woman, she can't stay in a hotel by herself. So the guard, it happens that the airport closes in Riyadh around 11, and he came around, you can't be here. What are you going to do with me? Trust me, she's a case. What could he do with her? So he let her sleep on the carpet of the floor of the mosque in the airport. They turned off the lights and locked up the airport, and she spent the night on the floor, and then the next day she went for her interview. And that's what it's like for a young professional woman in Saudi Arabia. Now, the men, if anything, are even more affected by this gender apartheid. One of my young male reporters, we went to a mall together, and there were these three Saudi, they used to call them BMOs, black moving objects. And they were coming down the escalator, and without a trace of irony, my young reporter turned to me and said, check them out. So, you tell me. I was in Saudi Arabia in 2003 when we invaded Iraq. And my family was scattered around. Our daughter was in Italy in a demonstration. Roberta was back in Austin marching. My son was in Chicago marching, and I was there very close to the war. And I was ambivalent about it because I bought the idea about the weapons of mass destruction. And I thought it's way too dangerous to have Saddam Hussein have weapons of mass destruction. And I didn't think at the time that my country would lie to me. But this was the first fruit of torture. The ways in which we went into Iraq. Ibn Sheikh al-Libi was an associate of Al-Qaeda, not an actual member, but he was picked up in Afghanistan. And at the time, the CIA decided to send him to Egypt because there's an adage in the agency at the time, send them to Egypt in the morning, you get the answers in the afternoon. And so the answers they got were that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He was working with Al-Qaeda to share them. And that was the basis of Colin Powell's speech at the United Nations. So we went into Iraq on the basis of that mistaken, tortured lie. So America was changing as a response to terrorism, but jihad was also changing. We think oftentimes that ISIS is like the child of Al-Qaeda, but the truth is you might envision it more like the younger brother. When I was researching Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, I was puzzled. Where are the Jordanians and the Lebanese and the Palestinians, the area of the Middle East that we call the Levant or the Sham in Arabic? Where are they? Because you would think they'd be in Al-Qaeda. And I found that there was actually another training camp in Al-Qaeda at the same time, run by a man named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And he is the progenitor of ISIS. Bin Laden gave him some money, gave him $5,000, kind of just to keep him quiet. But they were two very different men. Bin Laden was an international businessman. He had an agenda, but mainly it was to drive the West out of the Muslim lands. Zarqawi had a different agenda. He wanted to start a caliphate right away, and he wanted to purify Islam. And the way to do that was to create a civil war between the Sunnis and the Shiites. And we've seen the effectiveness of this tactic. Now, I've written a lot about this in my book, and I think I'll talk a little bit about how terrorism might end. There's a study by Audrey Kurth Cronin at George Mason University. She studied hundreds of, 400, I think, different terrorist organizations, and to see, what happens to them. She found that the average lifespan of a terror organization was 7 years. Well, Al-Qaeda's just celebrated its 28th birthday, so obviously it's a lot more durable. And religious organizations, religious terrorist groups tend to last longer. There was one terror group called the Hindu Thugs. That's where the name comes from. It lasted 600 years. I don't think that we're in for that. But ways in which terror organizations come to an end, decapitation. It worked very well with Aum Shinrikyo. If you remember, just to take the terror thing off of Islam, this was a blind Japanese yoga instructor, Buddhist, and in my thinking, it could have been a much more dangerous organization than Al-Qaeda because of the technical proficiency and their avid need to create some kind of weapons of mass destruction. Once he was arrested, that organization became toothless. That was the same thing with Shining Path in Peru. Sometimes negotiation works, like with the IRA. It took decades, but there has been a peaceful resolution. Sometimes terror organizations evolve into politics or to crime. I think that the Taliban could go either direction, especially with their involvement in opium dealing. Sometimes terror organizations succeed. I just spoke about Menachem Begin. The same thing would be true of Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. They had a terror wing, and he modeled it on Irgun. But most of them fail. And that's the only route that Al-Qaeda and ISIS can go, because they're apocalyptic cults without any kind of negotiable demands. There's no way to negotiate with them. They're going to be a pernicious presence in our lives, I fear, for quite a while. Now, I want to end this with a little statement about what's happened to our country since then. And I'm going to take you back to 1965, when I took a date to the airport. Now, I didn't have enough money to go to the movies in Dallas, Texas. But it wasn't that uncommon, maybe just in Dallas. They call it Love Fields. But my girlfriend and I went out to the airport, and we walked out on the tarmac, and we climbed up into this international jetliner that had just come from some exotic port of call, we thought Paris, perhaps. And we sat in the first class section, and a stewardess, as we called them then, served us a treat, and we sat there and pretended to be cosmopolitan. And then we went up in the FAA tower, and I opened the unlocked door, and, "Hi, kids, come on in." So we sat down there and watched them landing the planes. Now, that America's gone. Terrorism killed it. But I don't want it to be forgotten. I look around this room, I know most of you remember that America, but your children don't. And your grandchildren, for them it'd be a kind of a fantasy. But the idea that you have to have your photograph taken every time you walk into an office building, you have to take off your shoes and your belt when you visit the Liberty Bell, these are all individual liberties that they seem small, but they represent big losses to the kind of country we were. And I'm not saying that those sacrifices weren't important. We had to make some of those sacrifices to keep us safe. But if we forget that America, and we fail to steer in that direction, then terrorism really will have won. Well, thank you very much.
During Book TV's recent